you sat down, and it was a stat that stood out to me when I read the story as well. 7 out of 10 of the biggest ports in the world are in China, right?
That's right, yeah. And how many are in Europe or the U.S.?
Yeah.
0. So, yeah, if trade is a battlefield, ports are really on the front lines of what's going on, not only in the geoeconomic disputes that are happening, playing out between the U.S. and China and the European Union, but it's also they're transforming to digital technologies. They're decarbonizing. So ports are really $200 billion worth of investment a year for the next decade is the figure that we report on today. That's a lot of money going into port infrastructure and the industries that congregate around ports.
Talk to us in the context of some of the issues that ports have been facing. Union workers have been one of them. Wages have been one of them. But then in the broader shipping industry as well, you have lags on fuel, the tensions in the Red Sea. How does that show up when it comes to congestion in some of these ports? Yeah,
well, it can really, well, we're going to find out in the U.S. right now. There's the dock workers on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast those talks, their contract talks are at an impasse. They're hung up over automation. So new technologies going into ports to make them more efficient, make them more productive is really playing out with the workers there. Ports are also, decarbonizing all those pipelines that we and electrical grids that run through them are being overhauled. So that's another big part of the investment that we're seeing.
So you've got China, a major focus, but you've also got Africa as well. Somaliland is an area where we're seeing particularly the Gulf countries stepping up and creating a huge footprint. Like Dubai, ports like that have always been big import-export ports, but we're seeing that kind of slightly shifting around in terms of the geography. How does what's happening in the Red Sea feed into that? How does the regional politics feed into that? How big a kind of setup could we see ultimately in East Africa?
Yeah, well, in the past 6 months, as you mentioned, the Red Sea turmoil, the attacks on ships have rerouted a large portion of global trade shipped from east to west. That's been absorbed for the most part. Shipping rates went up, but now they're coming back down. So we're seeing strategic investments in ports in Africa, like you said, Somaliland and elsewhere. These markets where consumer spending is growing, a burgeoning middle class is happening.
Yeah. But is that an import-export story, or is it they're there to fill domestic demand?
Well, ultimately it should be both. The emerging markets, they want to export their way to prosperity. That's been the model in the past, and following on that, you get a consumer base that wants to buy goods from around the world.
How does that show up in the pricing, though? And it feels like when we talk to shipping CEOs on this very show, they've said, look, even though the consumer story in the States may be slowing down a bit, we're not recessionary territory yet, the Chinese consumer is still growing and rebounding in a way that we didn't really expect, say, even 6 months ago. That's showing up in the shipping story. But where's the weakness there? Well,
what we're going to see is all of these transformations, all this investment that's going in is ultimately going to feed through into consumer prices and producer prices. The inflation story that we've been following, inflation is coming down in most major economies in the world. But there's only so much that they can fall now that all this investment has to go in. These green corridors that companies want to pay for to have their goods shipped around the world, those are not going to be free. There's going to be a surcharge for those. So ultimately, we're seeing inflation come down as it relates to shipping, but it's not going back to the pre-pandemic, rock bottom lows that we saw.